Story 17 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annabelle Smith. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J.E. Muddock. Story 17. The Dream That Came True. A Woman's Story. In the autumn of the year 18 I went down to a quiet little village in the borderland of Dumfriesshire, intending to spend a few weeks there for the sake of rest and change. For 3 years I had been engaged in teaching in Glasgow, and overstudy, together with the climate and smoke of that grimy city, had undermined my health, so that rest and quiet had become an imperative necessity. I went to the village I speak of by the advice of my doctor, who told me that the air was bracing, the country round about delightful, and the place a perfect sleepy hollow, while I should be able to live there for, as he put it, an old song. This to me was a great consideration, for my purse was slender, and I was a delicate woman, dependent upon my own exertions for a livelihood. Under these circumstances, my doctor's recommendation was not to be ignored, and through his instrumentality I obtained lodgings in a small farm, occupied by kindly and homely people who knew little of the world beyond their own neighbourhood. The good wife was some 60 years of age, and dearly loved a crack. She was chatty and gossipy, and seemed to know the histories of all the people in the village and its neighbourhood from their birth upwards. In the course of a week, she had enlightened me as to who everyone was, seeming to take a keen delight in repeating every little bit of scandal, with a running commentary of her own. I was not particularly interested in the old body's chatter, but it rather amused me than otherwise, and as it seemed to afford her pleasure, I allowed her to rattle on, while I was content to sit in a large old-fashioned chair and doze in dreamy indolence. "I was mindin'," she said to me one day, regretfully, "that there's ane person that I haven't helped you aboot, but the fact is I dinna ken aught aboot her myself. We ca' her the Mystery, but she's a poor, daft-like creature, and is no muckle worth troubling aboot." My interest was at once thoroughly aroused, for I saw instantly that my landlady's disrespectful way of speaking arose from a sense of wounded vanity at not having been able to learn anything about this mysterious person, who, I felt sure, must be remarkable, since she had been able to defy the prying impertinence of this old woman. "Indeed," I remarked, "and where does this Mystery live?" "Weel, maybe you've been seeing an auld, ragged-looking hoose just beyond the village there to the east. It stands in a bit of ground, and has a lot of green stuff growing up it." I had to confess that I had not noticed this particular house, whereupon my entertainer expressed great surprise, and went on to inform me that for a long time it had been without a tenant, but at last had been bought by its present occupant, who had resided in it ever since with one servant, an old woman who, according to this dear old gossip's account, was waur than the mistress, for folk couldna get a thing oot o' her. I was amused at the indignant way in which my landlady spoke, as though she considered, and as a matter of fact she did so consider, that she and the little community had been scandalized and outraged by this mysterious lady not at once proclaiming her whole history for the benefit of the gossips. To her it seemed really shameful, but to me this reticence presented itself in the light of a virtue, and I felt drawn towards the unknown lady by a bond of sympathy. She bore the somewhat uncommon name, as I learnt, of Slark, Mrs. Lydia Slark. She went to the village church every Sunday, owed no one a penny in the place, was quiet and uncommunicative, and neither visited nor received visitors. This was the sum and substance of what was known about her, and a person could thus keep her affairs to herself in so small a community was sure to be looked upon with suspicion, and spoken of as a mystery, while dark hints might even be dropped that such a remarkably reticent person must be in league with the evil one himself. Now, being a woman, my curiosity was naturally stimulated by this information, and though I did not like tittle-tattle, and never concerned myself about other folks' private business, I could not avoid a secret desire to know something of the mysterious lady who had so successfully defied the scrutiny of a whole village. A day or two later, I made my way towards the residence of Mrs. Slark. It was a sombre day, and the brown withered leaves, last sad relics of summer glories, lay thickly strewn about the roads and lanes, ever and anon being whirled around in little columns by the fitful gusts of wind that swept across the land, heralding the approach of winter. Little of the house could be seen from the road, owing to intervening trees and shrubs. Wishing to get a better view of it, I pushed open the heavy iron gate, which creaked with a sort of complaint at being disturbed from its rusty indolence. I advanced for some yards up the pathway, until I was enabled to obtain a full view of the building. It was a large, old-fashioned brick house, the walls almost hidden from view by clustering ivy. The grounds were overgrown with weeds and rank grass, and there was not a single patch of cultivation to relieve the eye. The entrance to the house was by a porch, over which a wild honeysuckle had straggled in the wildest disorder, and hung down in ragged festoons, giving the place a forlorn and neglected appearance. With one exception, every window was shrouded by a dingy yellow blind. Before the porch, in the center of a little circular plot of rusty green grass, was a fountain with a stucco basin, in which were a few inches of dirty water and a figure that had fallen from its pedestal. It was a composition statue of a female half-draped, but now it was covered with slime and dirt. As I gazed on all this desolation, I thought of Edgar Allan Poe's House of Usher, and I almost expected to see this neglected building sink with a crash beneath my feet. As I was about to turn and leave the grounds, I was suddenly arrested by the shrill trilling of a canary, and, looking in the direction from whence the sounds proceeded, I saw that the little songster was hung in a gilded cage at the only window not screened by a blind. But it was not the only thing I saw, for a lady was standing there also. I felt ashamed of myself for having thus intruded, and commenced to retrace my steps. But before I was hidden by the trees, I heard a cough, and, looking round, saw the lady on the doorstep. I felt now that I could not retreat without some few words of excuse for my rudeness, so, going back, I began to stammer forth something about my being a stranger in the place, and to mumble apologies for intruding on her privacy. I noted that the lady was about 50 years of age, and of commanding presence. She had once been beautiful, and even then there were traces of beauty remaining, though sorrow and time together had ploughed ruts in the once fair brow. She had soft, tender blue eyes, and the hair, though iron grey, was abundant, and braided in thick plaits, which were twisted round the head somewhat in the old German fashion. In the face itself there was such an expression of sadness that I felt drawn towards her, a sadness that was by no means expelled, but rather emphasized, by the smile with which she greeted me. "You seem interested in my poor abode," she remarked in a musical and plaintive voice. "I am afraid I have been excessively rude," I replied, "but the fact is—" "Pray do not excuse yourself," she returned kindly. "I saw that you were a stranger, for I know by sight all the people round about. It is not often I am honoured with visitors, more especially a lady, and if you will please to come in and partake of my humble hospitality, you are very welcome." I was naturally astonished at this freely proffered invitation, for I had been led to imagine that the owner of the house was a morose, surly person, who shunned all intercourse with her fellows. But instead of that, I found her charming in every respect, and proffering me hospitality without the slightest knowledge as to who I was. I understood at once that she was a superior person, and had silently resented the impudent attempts of her neighbours to probe her heart. "You are very kind," I answered, "but the fact is I am somewhat of a valetudinarian. I have overworked myself in Glasgow, and came down here for rest and change. My intrusion on your privacy cannot be excused." "Pray say no more," she exclaimed with such heartiness that I was completely set at rest, and she extended her hand to me, a hand that was soft and white. I was much struck by this spontaneous cordiality to an utter stranger, and producing my card case, I gave her my card and mentioned the name of my doctor, on whose recommendation I had come down. "Pray come in," she said, in her pleasant, persuasive way, as she glanced at my card. I followed her through the dimly lighted hall into the room at the window of which the canary still warbled. It was a dingy, musty apartment. The paper on the walls was greatly discolored by age, while the carpet was so faded that it had become a dirty grey. Half a dozen lumbering mahogany chairs, a round table, a small well-stocked bookcase, and a mirror over the mantelpiece, together with a massive marble clock and a few ornaments, constituted the whole of the furniture. But I noted at one end of the room, hanging in the centre of the wall that faced the light, was a very massive picture frame, but I could not determine then as to what the frame contained, for it was partly screened by a black velvet curtain, which was only a little smaller than the frame itself. When I had taken a rapid survey of the room, the strange occupant of the house motioned me to be seated. "Although we are strangers," she said, "I am so glad you have come. It is years since I have received a visitor, and when I saw one of my own sex in the garden, I could not resist the temptation to break the monotony I have so long endured." "Surely, madam," I began, feeling that I was being drawn towards this woman in an unaccountable way, "it must have been a strange cause that induced you to immure yourself in such a way, for I may frankly state that I have heard in the village that you lead a hermit sort of life." "Yes," she answered with a sigh, "the cause is strange. But let me offer you some refreshment." In spite of my protest, she rang the bell, and the old woman, who had been described to me as "waur than the mistress," appeared, and her mistress bade her put some luncheon on the table in another room. In a few minutes the luncheon was announced as ready, and during the time that we were partaking of it, my hostess with tact and skill managed to learn a good deal about myself. I found her charming and irresistible, and by the time the meal was finished I really felt as if I could tell her anything, and that instead of having known her for a brief hour, I had known her for years. Luncheon finished, she invited me to return to the parlour. We chatted away for some time, and she gradually grew more confidential, and on my remarking, "Although I know nothing of your history, I venture to give expression to my sympathy, for I am sure that only some great sorrow could have driven one so accomplished as yourself into such exile as this." She turned away for a few moments as if overcome with emotion, which my words had aroused. Then she answered, "You are right. It was a great sorrow, and one as unexpected as it was overwhelming. You see that frame?" pointing to the frame on the wall. "It contains a portrait. For years it has hung there as you see, but I have never dared to gaze upon it. Your visit here has awakened many bitter memories, and has served to accentuate my loneliness. It has produced in me a strange longing to break the spell by which I seem to be surrounded, and I crave for sympathy and comfort. You will think me strange and eccentric, no doubt, but if you knew my sorrow you would excuse me." "Indeed, I do excuse you as it is," I said, endeavouring to express by my tone how truly sympathetic I was. Women are quick to take to each other under such circumstances, jealous of each other, and bitter, and even cruel they can be, but once let them be drawn towards each other by heart sorrow, and they can at once be all tenderness, all truth, all love. Men cannot understand this feeling, but women know how true it is. Mrs. Slark came to the chair on which I was seated, and taking my hand, she grasped it warmly, saying in trembling accents, "This does me good. It breaks the ice, as it were. It thaws me. For the first time in many years, I will once more gaze upon that portrait. Often in my solitude have I been tempted to do so before, but I felt that I dare not while alone." She advanced to the wall, drew back the dusty velvet, and disclosed the portrait of a gentleman. Time and neglect had laid their destroying hands on the picture, but the face was perfect. It was that of a man in the meridian of life. The forehead was massive, bespeaking intelligence, but the eyes were the largest and strangest eyes I ever saw. It seemed to me as if there was something weird and even supernatural in them, and so faithfully had the artist done his work that, even after the long lapse of years, they seemed to glow from the canvas with a living light. When Mrs. Slark drew the velvet, she turned deadly pale, trembled violently, and fixed her gaze on the painting. When some minutes had passed, and seeing how violently agitated she was, I arose, and, going to her, I laid my hand on her shoulder, saying softly, "You do not seem well. The portrait evidently affects you." She relinquished her hold of the velvet, which fell into its place again. Then, as I led her to a seat, she burst into tears. I did not speak again for some moments. I knew it was better she should weep. "Forgive my weakness," she said at last, "but the sight of that portrait has strangely affected me. Dare I inquire the cause of a sorrow so great as yours?" I asked. "Yes," she answered. "I feel that it would do me good to impart to another the secret I have so long pent up in my own breast. Ah, how terribly a man may blight a woman's life!" I assented to this with a sigh. "The original of that portrait was my husband. It is now nearly 30 years since I was married to him, but he was not my first love. You know we women say that a woman never gets her first love, and no doubt it's true. He whose bride I hoped to become had been acquainted with me from my earliest girlhood. His name was Meredith, Walter Meredith. He was highly gifted, a poet of no mean order, and somewhat of a dreamer. One day when he came to see me he was much distressed. I asked him what had upset him, and he said I should laugh if he told me. I urged him, however, and he informed me that we should never become man and wife. "But why?" I exclaimed. "Well," he continued somewhat reluctantly, 3 times running I have dreamed a dream." In spite of my promise, I could not help laughing, and said banteringly, "Surely you are of sterner stuff than those who are affected by dreams." "I tell you, Lydia," he answered, "I have dreamed this dream 3 times running. I thought that I had a false friend, who outwardly had a smooth and honest face, but in my dream I was permitted to see another face beneath that one, and it was a bad, cruel, deceitful face. And wherever he went I saw burning above his head like a halo the word death in letters of fire, and the end of this dream each night was that the strange man seized me in his powerful arms and hurled me into space. And down I sank, plunging into horrid darkness, until, when the climax of agony was reached, I awoke with a start, and found myself bathed in perspiration." I laughed again as he finished, but he assured me that the dream had made a singular impression upon him, and it had begotten him a presentiment that he could not shake off. About 6 months after he had related this extraordinary dream to me, my only brother, who had been travelling in Italy, returned, bringing with him an Italian friend, who was visiting England for the first time. His name was Carlo Garcia, and he became our guest. It is useless for me to attempt to deny the fact, and equally useless to attempt to explain it. The fact is that that man, Carlo Garcia, exercised an extraordinary fascination over me. He was highly educated, but withal a mystic, and he had done something more than dabble in those things which are supposed to be beyond the reach of our human intellect. He was a brilliant conversationalist, a pleasant companion, and there were few subjects that were beyond his grasp. He came to us for a few weeks, but he and my brother were soon so attached that his stay stretched into months. His charm of manner and conversation seemed to influence all with whom he came in contact, and though I used to think Meredith was sometimes jealous of him, even he convinced to admiring him. Near the end of the 5th month of Garcia's stay with us, and when the day for my wedding with Walter Meredith was drawing near, the terrible news came to us one morning that Walter's body, shattered almost out of recognition, had been found at the base of some tremendous chalk cliffs that rose up from the seashore near our residence. You see, I speak calmly now, but that event threatened for some time not only my reason, but my life. Over the cliffs a pathway ran, and this was a favorite walk of Walter's. In one part of the edge of the cliffs was a great notch, as though a piece had been scooped out with a huge gauge. The gap sloped at a steep angle for a dozen yards or so, then ended abruptly, and went down 200 feet perpendicularly. It was at the foot of this place that Meredith's body was found lying on the hard shingle, which was reddened with his blood. Investigation proved beyond doubt that he slipped down the gap I have spoken of. But no investigation brought to light how he came to go down there. A month later, Garcia returned to Italy, and I saw nothing of him again for a whole year, when unexpectedly he presented himself at our house, and within a very short time after he began to talk love to me. The old fascination he had once exercised over me revived, and though I could not forget my dead love, I found myself falling under this strange man's influence, and when one day he asked me to become his wife, I was not so much surprised as alarmed. I say alarmed because somehow I could not shake off a vague feeling of dread that I entertained for him. I could not possibly have defined this dread, but I knew that it existed, and I was so ashamed of it, because my people were wrapped up in him, that I kept it to myself. He spoke to my father and mother and brother, and as they were in favor of the union, and as he vowed that he would never know a moment's happiness unless I became his, I consented. Then he kissed me for the first time, and never shall I forget to my dying day the extraordinary thrill contact with his lips produced in me. It was not a thrill of pleasure, but pain, and that night, in the solitude of my own room, I asked myself whether I truly loved the man. I was conscious that he had exerted some strange power over me, and though I was fascinated, I could not determine if I loved him. She paused here, and presently said, "But perhaps my story is boring you?" "On the contrary," I exclaimed. "I assure you I am deeply interested." "Well, I will be brief. We were married. My wedding day, however, did not make me feel happy. My thoughts wandered back to the halcyon days, when I had given my heart to the man who then lay mouldering in his grave. I almost brought myself to believe that, by accepting the love of another, I was desecrating the dead man's memory. The marriage bells did not make music to my ears, but sounded harsh and inharmonious. And what struck me as being extraordinarily strange then was that my husband appeared melancholy. Outwardly, he was all gaiety, but it was forced. We went on the continent for our honeymoon, and the kindness and tenderness Carlo displayed entirely changed me, so that when we returned I felt that I loved him truly. But I noted with alarm that he was sinking into a state of morbid melancholy. He told me it was the effects of overstudy. He was engaged in drawing a chart of the heavens, astronomy being a subject in which he was passionately interested. We returned home, and settled down in a charming little retreat near Edinburgh. My husband, however, gradually grew worse. His eyes assumed a wild, vacant stare, and his face became deathly pale, while white threads appeared in his black hair. He would walk the garden which surrounded the house in the wildest storm, his eyes ablaze, his arms beating the air. I grew terribly alarmed, and consulted a physician, but Carlo declined to see him. In the course of 6 months, this young and handsome husband of mine had become a prematurely old man. His whole nature, too, had changed. He was irritable, fretful, and neglected me. I saw clearly that something was affecting his mind, but, though I saw the effect, I was powerless to discover the cause. One evening when we were sitting together, he suddenly sank on his knees with a wild cry of despair, and, covering his face with his hands, he exclaimed, spare me, for mercy's sake, spare me." I almost fainted with fright, but rushing to him, I asked him what was the matter. He was bathed in perspiration, his eyes were wild, his face and lips blanched, and he had a dazed, stunned appearance. I helped him to a chair, and revived him with stimulants, but he could not, or would not, give me any reasons for his strange attack. From that hour he seemed to grow more and more melancholy, and I had him closely watched, for I felt sure insanity was approaching. The denouement came at last. It was a Sunday evening. I had been to church, leaving Carlo at home, for he would not be persuaded to go with me. A sullen, gloomy day had culminated in a night of storm. A fierce gale drove in from the sea, bringing heavy squalls of rain with it. Our house was much exposed, and very lonely, standing as it did, by itself on an elevation, with lofty trees surrounding it. We kept a large watchdog, and on this particular night he howled and whined in a manner altogether unusual. I, too, seemed to be the victim of some extraordinary nervousness, which was increased, or possibly engendered, by the howling of the dog, the screeching wind, the rustling of the trees, and the beating rain. I had already sent one of the servants to try and calm the dog, but her efforts had been fruitless, and working up at last to a state of unbearable irritation, I begged my husband to go out, unchain the poor brute, and bring him into the kitchen. Somewhat reluctantly he consented to do this, and threw a mackintosh over his shoulders. As he opened the door, a furious gust of wind whirled a heap of leaves into the hall, and at the same moment there was a terrific crash, and something came thundering down close to the steps. Carlo rushed back into the room, his face livid, his hair almost standing on end, and he sank helpless into a chair. I went into the hall to try and close the door, and I found that a pine tree had been torn up by the roots and hurled across the pathway. When I returned, my husband was sitting in the same position. I tried to soothe him. I pressed his head to my bosom. I bathed his temples and spoke words of comfort. Suddenly he started up, and pushing me away, exclaimed, "Lydia, do not touch me. You are an angel of mercy, but I am lost, lost. I have deceived you, but can do so no longer. My secret has tortured me with the torture of the damned. Your lover, Meredith, was slain by me. I pushed him over the cliff because I was jealous of him, and I wanted you for myself. Since then, he has haunted me." He screamed out here and pointed to a long window that opened onto a lawn, and at which the curtains had not been drawn. Almost mechanically, I turned to where he pointed, and whether it was that my imagination had been wrought up to a morbid condition by what I had gone through, and the awful revelation I had just listened to, I know not, but this I vow is true. In the blackness of the window, I saw a shadowy form. Then my husband sank to the floor with a groan. "Will this torture never end?" he muttered. When I looked at the window again, the figure had gone. There was an appalling silence in the room then, a silence broken only by the furious beating of my own heart, which I distinctly heard, and by the clock on the mantelpiece, the heavy ticking of which seemed to me like the sounds of an axe ringing on a steel plate. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move hand or limb. A spell seemed to have been set upon me. Oh, the horror of that moment! It was as if every second was an age. I found myself looking at my husband. His face was ghastly. His eyes were bent fixedly on the window. He was gasping for breath, and seemed to be choking, and I have a recollection that I tried to speak, but my tongue refused utterance. I closed my eyes at last to shut out the horror of that man's face. Then I experienced a sensation as if I was being whirled round and round with tremendous velocity. Once more I opened my eyes and looked at him. He had not moved. His face seemed to have become more ghastly. The blue veins stood out on his temples like cords. His eyes appeared to glow with absolute fire. I felt then that if the spell was not broken, I should fall down dead. Suddenly, a mist seemed to rise from the floor. All things faded from my sight, and there was a blank. I had swooned. How long I lay there I know not, but it must have been a long time, for when I awoke the eastern light was breaking. My hair was dishevelled, and the front of my dress was covered with clotted blood. I had evidently bled from the nostrils, and I suppose that had saved my life. Then the horror of all I had endured rushed through my brain. I feared to look round lest I should again see his awful face. I called him by his name. There was no answer. Then, with an all but superhuman effort, I turned to where I had last seen him, but he had gone, and I was alone. For many hours after, I lay in a raging fever. Kind friends flitted round my bed, and ministered to my wants, but he came not. I feared to ask the question that trembled on my lips. Where was he? At length my attendants seemed to come and go with a stealthier tread. I saw strangers in the room, and people spoke in mysterious whispers. I could bear this suspense no longer. "Where is my husband?" I cried. Each one turned to the other and seemed to be communicating by strange signals. "Tell me," I repeated, "where is my husband?" "You shall know soon," they answered. "I will know now," I shrieked as, springing from the bed and breaking away from them, I rushed to his room and saw him dead and in his coffin. I had a serious relapse, and for a long time fluttered between life and death, but my time had not come, and slowly I recovered. Then I learned that on the morning following that awful night he had been found at the bottom of the garden, lying on his face, stark and dead, with the blue blood oozing from his mouth. As you may imagine, that place was fraught with too much that was painful for me to remain there, and for a long time I travelled about with my mother until she died, and soon after I lost my only brother. The charm of life had now gone for me. The world could give no pleasure, and so at last I came here to bury myself in solitude with an old and faithful servant who will remain with me as long as I live, and in order to lose my identity as far as possible, I assumed the name of a relative. I listened with absorbed interest to this remarkable story, which was told with striking dramatic power. She was the better for having told me her history, for her solitude and the burden of her secret had become unbearable. From that hour, a strong friendship sprang up between us, and it resulted in my going to live with her. The friendship was uninterrupted for 6 years. Then I nursed her in a brief illness, which terminated in her sudden death. She had willed her property to me, and the first thing I did was to utterly destroy the portrait of Carlo Garcia, for it filled me with a sense of horror. I had looked upon it once, and once only. That was on the morning when I first made the acquaintance of Mrs. Slark, but after I knew her story, the veiled portrait became for me an object of dread, and I felt relieved when I knew it had been put out of existence. End of Story 17. Recording by Annabelle Smith.
Story 18 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Story 18, The Compact. On December 24, 1840, 4 young men were, in their own way, enjoying themselves at the charming little inn known as Die Eiserne Glocke, the Iron Bell, situated about 2 miles from Heidelberg, on the banks of the Neckar. This inn, which stood in extensive grounds, on a steep hillside, the hill at its base being washed by the river, and covered to its summit with a pine forest, was situated in one of the most notable beauty spots in that beautiful region. In summertime, Die Eiserne Glocke drove a roaring trade, for the salubrity of the air, the beauty of the surroundings, and the exquisite walks through the pine woods were a source of irresistible attraction, both for the Heidelbergers themselves and the strangers visiting the far-famed scholastic town. In winter, however, it might have closed its doors for all the trade it did. Not that the romance and beauty were less, but your German is not fond of stirring far from the warmth of his huge porcelain stove in the winter-time, and the strangers at that season are few and far between. What, then, were these 4 young men doing there on the 24th of December, 1840. That question shall at once be answered. Firstly, the weather was magnificent, the air was crystalline, the sky an unclouded azure, the sun brilliant, but the temperature below freezing point, and the country all round whitened with snow. The four men were bachelors, with no relatives in Heidelberg, and, being warm and fast friends, they had agreed to spend this day together, and had sent a message to Mein Host of Die Eisenglocke, to whom they were well known, to prepare a sumptuous dinner for them. They had been working and studying hard, and were for the nonce going to have a day of thorough indolence, pure air and enjoyment, and there was no place they could have selected within the same distance that would have so thoroughly answered their purpose as this exquisitely situated little mountain inn. These four men were men of learning and science, although young. One still lives as I write this, and is celebrated throughout Europe. Two died comparatively recently, having carved their names on the imperishable records of their country as workers in the vast fields of science. The fourth died young. One was Professor Fritz Oppenheimer of Bamberg in Bavaria, doctor of moral philosophy in the College of Heidelberg. Another was Ludwig Demmer of Munich, professor of chemistry in the same college, but who was leaving in 3 months to proceed to St. Petersburg to fulfill a similar position there. The third, Dr. Gustav Unger of Mainz on the Rhine, doctor of medicine, who had but recently taken his degree, having been studying for several years in Heidelberg, and who was going shortly to Berlin. The fourth, an Englishman, Walter Harold Croxford of Bath. He was a B.A. of Oxford University, and at this time leading a kind of dilettante life. For having ample means, he had not been driven by necessity to fix on a profession, but he had a great love for science in all its branches, and a passion for botany and geology. He had gone to Heidelberg nearly 3 years before to perfect himself in the German language and in these particular branches of study, and now he was on the eve of leaving to commence a tour round the world in order to prosecute his botanical and geological researches. And Gustav Unger was to start in a few days to take up his position as a junior physician in one of the hospitals in Berlin, a post to which he had recently been appointed. Such, then, were the personages of the little party, and, as already stated, being much attached to each other, they were spending this Christmas Eve together, previous to separating, perhaps never to meet again. Being all in vigorous health, with perfect digestions, they enjoyed a sumptuous dinner with a liberal supply of noted Rhine wines, and a couple of bottles of mine host's special reserve of champagne, which he kept solely for distinguished visitors. The landlord's name was Katzenstein, an honest, blunt, shrewd fellow who had occupied the inn for over 20 years, and who was about as prosaic and sceptical a man as one could have met in a day's march. He had a habit of saying, "I believe little but what I see, and not too much of that." It is well to remember this in connection with what follows. The four gentlemen, having finished dining, and having dined like gentlemen, went on to the veranda, which overhung the river, where they had chairs and a table placed, and cigars and black coffee brought. The veranda faced the west, and the slanting rays of the afternoon sun shining full on it made it warm and pleasant. The four friends were very merry. Their laughter rose into the crisp air and echoed from the rocky cliffs on the other side of the river. Slowly the sun sank. The snow-clad fir trees caught its glow, and the river rolled red, and redder it grew as the sun went down, and a warm flush lingered in the sky. But this changed to orange, and that in turn gave place to a cold green, until the trees looked ghastly in their snowy robes, and the river was ebony. The sharpness of the air increased, and at last Unger jumped to his feet and exclaimed, "Come, gentlemen, let us go in. It is too cold here." For nearly half an hour they had been silent and thoughtful. The growing stillness, the fading lights, the ghostly landscape possibly affected them a little, though they might have hesitated to confess that. And another thing that had made them thoughtful was a remark by Croxford. "Well, comrades and friends of mine, I wonder if we four will ever come together again on earth." It is well known how a remark of this kind, uttered under such circumstances, will produce an impression on the minds even of men of thought and learning. For there is nothing so certain in this world as the uncertainty of life, and when we say au revoir, it often means adieu. All the gentlemen rose, shook themselves, stretched their arms, then filed into the comfortably warmed room through the long open window. "Hi, Katzenstein!" shouted the cheery Oppenheimer, whose full compassed voice was suggestive of a lion's roar, for it had in it some of that solidity, that depth, that great volume which distinguishes the king of beasts. "Hi, Katzenstein! Shut the window and draw the curtains." Obedient to the command, Katzenstein, who was massive as a bull, entered with a big pipe in his hand, and smoke still issuing from under his ponderous moustache. He closed the window and was going to draw the curtains when Croxford, who had an artist's instincts and something of an artist's talent, said quietly, "Leave the curtains, Katzenstein. There are some beautiful colors still lingering in the sky. Besides, I should like to see the moon rise over that landscape." "Ja," grunted Katzenstein. "Herr Croxford is sentimental." At this they all laughed, and Ludwig Dimmer said, "Oh, we all know that, don't we, Croxford?" "Well, it depends on what you mean by sentimental," returned Croxford, with the air of a man who was pondering over something. "Well, you are given to dreaming a bit, old comrade, eh?" said Unger, slapping his friend heartily on the back. "Yes, a little." "And you've been dreaming within the last half hour?" put in Dimmer. "Yes." "Now, what have you been dreaming?" they all asked. "I'll tell you. I've been wondering whether after death a man really can revisit those he loves." "Ah, ha, ha, ha!" roared the friends in unison. And when their roar died down, Katzenstein, who stood motionless as a statue, stolidly smoking his great pipe, said solemnly, "Mein Herr, you will be the better for some of my punch." This was said so gravely, in a deep bass voice that seemed to roll upward from the landlord's ponderous Wellington boots, that the four gentlemen, who were all familiar with Katzenstein, laughed heartily, and Croxford exclaimed, "Bravo! The punch idea is good. What say you?" "Oh, punch by all means," said every one. "And mind you, Katzenstein," added Unger, "your special brew. Let your liquors be the primest, and blended with a touch of the true artist, while your flavorings must suggest the hand of the heaven-born genius." "Ja, Herren," grunted the landlord. "I have made punch for the Kaiser, and I will make the same for you." He went off leaving a great trail of smoke behind him. He was famed for his punch-making, and the guests knew that they might expect something good. "Now, Croxford," said Dimmer, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll thresh this subject of yours out, and while imbibing Katzenstein's spirits, we'll try and invoke spirits from the occult world, eh? What do you say?" "Good! Bravo!" cried the others. "We'll thresh the subject out," Croxford observed, "but neither the circumstances nor our mental condition are such as to be favourable to intercourse with those who have gone before." Dimmer and Oppenheimer laughed loudly as they proceeded to light up fresh cigars, but Unger, assuming an air of gravity, said, "I say, old fellow, have you really any belief in spiritualism?" "Let me ask you another question, friend Unger, before I answer that. Do you believe that men have a spiritual existence after they have done with this life?" "Well, yes, I think I do." "Then I believe in spiritualism," returned Croxford. "That is, I believe that the body dies, but something lives forever. You can give that something any name you like. Now, if you admit so much, why not go still further and say that there are conceivable conditions when we of the flesh may be brought face to face, or better phraseology will be to say, brought in juxtaposition with those who have preceded us into the silent land? Swedenborg went a good deal further than that, and Dante was a visionary and saw spirits." Croxford's friends all laughed as he talked thus. They laughed heartily, for they were very merry, and they were too full of robust life just then to think seriously of anything, more especially of death and after. Katzenstein now came in, bearing a huge bowl of antique shape and make, such as might have been used by roystering knights of the medieval ages, and from it rose a cloud of vapor like incense, going up to the altar of Bacchus, and following him came his daughter, carrying on a wooden trencher some of those massive and quaint old crystal goblets, such as one may sometimes see at the present day in Germany in out-of-the-way hostelries, where modern innovations have not been allowed to snap every link that binds us with the past. Mine host set the steaming bowl down on the table with grave deliberateness, as became so important an operation, and he gave vent to a long drawn-out "Ach!" which, being interpreted, was a grunt of self-satisfaction in this case. The gentlemen took their seats, and mine host's fair daughter Gretchen placed a goblet before each. Then Katzenstein stirred the punch with the big silver ladle, and filled each glass with a flourish and the air of a true artist. "There, Herren," he said, "that is fit for the Emperor himself." "Come, a goblet for yourself," cried Unger in his cheery strain. "Gretchen, another goblet," said the landlord to his daughter, and bowing with the grace and politeness peculiar to the old German landlords. The goblet was brought and filled. Then all rose to their feet and clinked. "Gesundheit, health, and to our next meeting." "Ah," sighed each of the guests, as he smacked his lips, "that's perfect." Katzenstein bowed at this testimony to his skill in the art of punch brewing. "Well, Katzenstein," said Demma, "as you have no other guests tonight to attend to, you must help us to dispose of the punch. Doctors don't usually take their own prescriptions, but in this case you must." Once more Katzenstein bowed. "I am honored," he said. Then, turning to his daughter, "Gretchen, bringen Sie meine pipe." The girl soon returned, bringing his great pipe, the stem of which was 3 feet long, and the china bowl had capacity for 1.5 ounces of tobacco. She filled it, lit it, then retired. The gentlemen lit fresh cigars, and settled down to the discussion of the punch and spiritualism. "Now, Croxford, dear old friend," cried Oppenheimer, "let us to the spirits again." Whereupon, amidst roars of laughter, Katzenstein filled each goblet to the brim with the steaming punch. "Those were not the spirits to which I alluded," said Oppenheimer, when he had recovered his breath. "I meant the spirits of the dead." "These spirits will do you more good," answered the landlord with imperturbable gravity, as he blew forth a vast volume of smoke from his capacious mouth. Of course there was more laughter, and when it had subsided, Croxford said, "Well, here's a subject for discussion. I maintain that there are conceivable conditions when the living man may see the spirit of a dead man." Katzenstein opened his big round eyes, but said nothing. There was a silence of some moments' duration. Then Demma spoke. "Yes, if he has partaken of too much of that," pointing to the punch bowl. All laughed but the landlord. He smoked in solemn silence, and every hair of his great moustache, which was like the eaves of a thatch, seemed to be giving forth a little stream of blue vapor. "He might see devils, then," returned Croxford, "but that is not what I mean. I mean spirits from the unseen and unknown world." "Bah!" muttered Unge. "I don't believe any living man ever yet saw a spirit, excepting he was mad or drunk. Then, of course, he would only see it in imagination." "And he would have to be very mad or very drunk," put in Katzenstein, smileless as a judge delivering sentence of death, and with slow and weighty utterance. Laughter followed this, of course, and when it had subsided, Croxford remarked, "Laughter and jest are good, but there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of even in our philosophy. Let us be merry, for tomorrow we die," said the philosopher. "Let us be merry," say I, "for tomorrow, or soon after, we part to meet again." "When?" "Well, I'll answer that," returned Unge. "We are old and attached friends. We have known many happy nights and days together, and such friendship as ours is not to be lightly broken. We are all going to separate, it is true. I go to Berlin, Oppenheimer stays here, Demma goes to St. Petersburg, and you, dear old boy, go further than any of us, for you go round the world. But if you travel round a globe in a straight line, you must come back in time to the point where you started from." "That's an erudite remark," put in Demma, with a merry twinkle of his eyes. "It is," continued Unge, "but what I was going to say is this: the mind reverts naturally to that which has afforded it pleasure, and bodies that have an affinity gravitate towards each other. We have an affinity, and this spot is fraught with many agreeable associations. Let us agree, then, to meet here again this day 3 years, and vow that nothing shall stop us short of serious illness and death." "Agreed, agreed!" cried Demma and Oppenheimer together. "What do you say?" asked Unge of Croxford, as he had not spoken. "Yes, I agree too," Croxford answered. "But I go farther than you, and say that, should any of us be dead, then the dead shall come too." The others laughed at this, but the laughter lacked something of its heartiness, for Croxford spoke solemnly and earnestly, and perhaps the others were beginning to realize a little more that separation of warm friends could not but be fraught with sadness. Katzenstein neither laughed nor spoke. His face was stolid and immovable, but the smoke came out in streams from under his moustache, as if fire was smouldering there. "That's a compact!" cried out Oppenheimer, with a little ironical laugh. "A compact! A compact!" exclaimed Unge and Demma. "A compact," said Croxford, rising to his feet. "Let us pledge ourselves to meet again here this day 3 years, living or dead. Katzenstein, you are a witness to this." "Ja, mein Herr," answered the landlord, as, rising, he filled the goblets once more. Each man raised his glass above his head, laid his left hand on his heart, and said, "I pledge myself to come here this day 3 years, if I am alive, and if I am dead, I will come if I can. And now, here is to our next meeting, and in the meantime, health, happiness, and prosperity." The toast was drunk with fervor, and the glasses filled again to confirm it. "Ach, Gott Herren! This is pleasant fooling," Katzenstein remarked. "Very pleasant," replied Oppenheimer, with a glance at the punch bowl. "I think we shall want some more of it." The bowl was subsequently replenished, and the hour was late when the 4 friends took their way back to Heidelberg, Katzenstein still smoking, giving each a hearty grip of the hand as he bade him "Gute Nacht" at the door. And as a parting word, and in his rolling, gruff voice, he said, "Remember, Herren, you are to honour my house again in 3 years." "Yes," they answered, "living or dead." "Living or dead," he echoed. "But dead men would be profitless. They don't drink punch." The 4 laughed merrily at this, and uttered the last Gute Nacht. The river seemed to repeat it with something like mournfulness, and Gute Nacht reverberated amongst the pine trees, which looked like ghosts in winding sheets. Overhead the stars glittered in frosty magnificence, and save for the river that moaned, there was a hush over the landscape like the hush of death, while the cold was intense. And, coming from the heated atmosphere of the room, the convivialists shuddered in spite of fur cloaks and wrappings. "Ugh!" cried Croxford, as he shook himself. "Somebody's walking over my grave. It would be a funny thing, dear old fellow, if you should be the dead man at our next meeting," Unger remarked. Then, in a half-angry tone, he added, "But a truce to this grim jesting. God keep you, dear boy." "Amen to that," chimed in the others. The subject was allowed to drop, and homeward they went. 4 days later, Croxford, with a tremor in his voice, wished his friends farewell and took his departure for England, preparatory to sailing for New York. 3 years have passed. It is once again Christmas Eve, and in that cheery room of Die Eiserne Glocke 3 of the 4 friends have assembled. These 3 are Fritz Oppenheimer, Ludwig Dimme, who had traveled from St. Petersburg specially to be present, and Gustav Unger, who had come from Berlin. Croxford is not present, but he is expected. Katzenstein has not changed a bit, and has prepared a most excellent dinner, which has been partaken of by the 3. The day has been very different to what it was at their last meeting. An unusually high temperature has prevailed, and all day long rain has poured down, and a boisterous gale has tossed the pine trees about in fury, while the river has growled and groaned like some huge beast in pain. The spirits of the 3 men, too, seemed to have caught some of the gloom which characterized the weather. They had eaten their dinner almost in silence, and not even Katzenstein's prime vintages seemed capable of raising them to a mirthful mood. "When do you say you last heard from Croxford?" asked Dimme, addressing Oppenheimer. "A little more than 3 months ago." "He was then in Constantinople, you say?" "Yes. Here is his letter, you see." And Oppenheimer produced a letter from his pocket. He says, "I have not forgotten our compact, and shall certainly be with you on December 24. I am full of wonder at all I have seen, and am in robust health and the best of spirits. The prospect of meeting you again elates me. Till then, adieu." "And you have heard nothing since then?" asked Unger. "No, not a word." It was impossible for those 3 friends to dismiss from their minds a feeling that something was wrong with their absent friend. He was one of the most punctilious of men, and very jealous of his honor when he had once pledged his word, but they did not give expression to this feeling. No one of them liked to be the first to utter what he feared. The afternoon waned, and the night fell from the low blurred sky of ashen gray. With the gathering darkness the wind increased, but the rain ceased, and in the course of an hour or so the clouds broke up into rugged masses, and a young moon threw a weird ghostly light over the landscape. Driven by the storm wind, the clouds hurried athwart the sky in fierce, eager haste, now shading the moon, now leaving it clear, while over the land strange, fantastic shadows swept in constant flight. At last Oppenheimer summoned Katzenstein and bade him prepare the punch, and in due course the worthy landlord came in bearing the huge steaming bowl, and followed by Gretchen with the goblets. "Of course you will join us," said Dimme, and with a self-satisfied "Ja, mein Herr," Katzenstein took his seat at the table, and Gretchen filled his great pipe and lit it for him. Then he ladled the odoriferous liquor into the goblets until each was full to the brim, but for some minutes no one seemed inclined to taste. At length Oppenheimer spoke. There was a mournfulness in his voice that he could not possibly conceal. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will remember that on the occasion of our last meeting, this day 3 years ago, we all agreed to assemble here today if alive." "Or dead," put in Unge, with a sorry attempt at a laugh. The remark caused a smile of skepticism to spread itself over the broad, stolid features of Katzenstein, who uttered a deep, bass "ugh," expressive of his contempt for such nonsense, as he would have termed it. "Or dead," echoed Oppenheimer. "Now, gentlemen, we are all here but one, and that one we know to be so scrupulously sensitive in regard to his engagements that his absence raises in my mind a fear that all is not well with him." "I am afraid so, too," fell from the lips of the others. "Well, now," continued Oppenheimer, "I am perfectly sure that not one of us expects for a moment that we shall see Croxford's spirit. I hope we have far too much common sense to believe for a moment in the supernatural. If Croxford is dead, and his spirit is conscious of things done in the flesh, and it has the power, there is little doubt it will present itself to us tonight. But a person being dead has done forever with the earth, and in spite of all the old women's tales, you may depend upon it the released spirit never again revisits the pale glimpses of the moon, so we will dismiss that idea from your minds. But as we are in doubt about our dear friend's fate, I propose that we drink in silence the toast to our absent friend. There is his empty chair, and if he can keep the compact, let him come and occupy it." All smiled as this was said, but as far as Unge, Oppenheimer, and Demmer were concerned, there was a want of life in the smile. In Katzenstein's case the smile was a sort of sneer, as though it was contemptible to think of such things. All rose to their feet, raised the goblets, and drank the toast, "To our absent friend." Then there was silence as the glasses were slowly drained. But in a few moments the silence was broken by a long-drawn sigh. A sigh may be terrible in the stillness of the night, or at such a moment as this, and it certainly had a startling effect on those who heard it. Then the glass fell from Unger's hand on to the table, and clutching Demmer's arm, he exclaimed under his breath, "My God! Look there!" He pointed to the vacant chair, vacant no longer, for in it sat a shadowy, ghostly form, and the form was that of Croxford. His face was deadly pale, and from a wound on his chest blood was streaming. The ponderous Katzenstein staggered and let his pipe crash to the ground, for even he saw it. And then, in solemn, awed tones, Oppenheimer said, "Our friend has kept his word, for he was too honorable to break it, even in death." "You see it?" asked Demmer hoarsely. "Yes," answered Oppenheimer, who, recovering his presence of mind, filled the goblets again, and said, "Gentlemen, let us drink now to our dead friend." The glasses were raised, and the liquor tasted, and the misty form in the chair bowed in turn to each, then vanished into the air, from whence it seemed to have evolved itself. When the spell which had fallen on the little assembly had passed away, Oppenheimer said, "Gentlemen, have we been cheating ourselves into a belief, or have we absolutely seen a spirit?" "Well, I can swear I saw Croxford's form in that chair," said Unge. "And I," repeated Demmer and Oppenheimer. "And did you not see it?" asked Oppenheimer of Katzenstein, who had not spoken. The worthy landlord seemed like one dazed, and after long reflection he said in his gruff tones, "Ja, I saw it, but ach Gott, I'm puzzled." Oppenheimer procured pen, ink, and paper, and writing out a circumstantial account of the incident, each one signed it. 3 days later, with the full consciousness of the importance that would be attached to such a document emanating from men of their standing, they went before the burgomaster, who was also notary public, and swore the following affidavit, which I have extracted from the archives of the town of Heidelberg. Affidavit, translation, 19 Hohenstrasse, Heidelberg, Prussia. The undersigned make solemn oath and say that on December 24, in the year 1840, they were assembled with one Croxford, an Englishman, in the Eiserne Glocke, kept by one Jacob Katzenstein, that they agreed to meet there again that day 3 years, living or dead. On the 24th of the current month, that is to say, December of the year 1843, Oppenheimer, Demme, and Unge did so meet, and while they and the landlord, that is, Katzenstein, were drinking a toast to their absent friend Croxford, his spirit form appeared seated in the chair reserved for him, and blood was seen issuing from the wound in his breast. Each of the undersigned saw this form distinctly, and heard it sigh. Signed, Fritz Oppenheimer, Professor of Philosophy, Ludwig Demme, Professor of Chemistry and Natural Science, St. Petersburg, Dr. Gustav Unge, Doctor of Medicine, practicing in Berlin, Jacob Katzenstein, landlord of Die Eiserne Glocke, sworn before me in accordance with the law prescribed for the administration of oaths in Prussia. Karl Peter Sternberg, Burgomaster of Heidelberg and Notary Public, in presence of Heinrich Schmidt, clerk to the Burgomaster, witness. 3 weeks after this affidavit had been made, by men whose word could not be impugned, news was received in Heidelberg that Croxford had been assassinated in Malta. Returning from the opera one night, he was set upon by some ruffians with a view to robbery. But as he offered resistance, being a powerful man, he was stabbed to the heart. Note by the author of the story: writing a short while ago to the venerable and renowned Professor Oppenheimer, who has been compelled by age and failing health to give up all work, to ask him to furnish me with the reason why he and his colleagues made the affidavit alluded to, he was courteous enough to give me the materials for the story. And in concluding his letter he said, "After 46 years my belief is unshaken that on the night of December 24, 1843, I actually saw the spirit of my dead friend. My friends Demme, Unge, and Katzenstein, who was one of the most skeptical of men, also entertained the same belief up to the moment of their deaths." End of story number 18. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.
Story 19 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Story 19. The Bell of Doom. Up to a few years ago, when it was accidentally burnt down and never rebuilt, the land being sold for other purposes, there stood a quaint and somewhat peculiarly constructed house near Lymington, on the borders of the New Forest. It was known as Solent View on account of the view it commanded of the Solent. Originally it must have been constructed at a remote period, and probably was a farmhouse, as part of it was timber, the front of this part being crossed by heavy black beams of oak. One of the owners, however, had in more recent times built a wing of white stone. It would have been difficult to have defined the precise order of architecture to which this wing belonged, but one thing that rendered it conspicuous was a square tower, not unlike an Italian campanile, and to complete the similitude this tower was provided with an iron bell. The reason for this bell being there no one could exactly tell, though tradition had it that the builder, with philanthropic motives, had placed it there that it might be rung in foggy weather as a warning to ships in the Solent. But tradition went even further than this, and said that the bell always solemnly tolled by itself whenever any member of the family was about to die. Solent View was certainly desirable as a place of residence, for it was most charmingly situated. Its front windows, and especially the tower, commanded a panoramic view of the Solent and the Isle of Wight, and it was said that on a clear day, and when the sea was rough, anyone standing on the summit of the tower could see the angry waves breaking in mountains of white foam against the Needles. The north side of the house, that is, the side furthest from the Solent, looked on to one of those exquisite glades peculiar to the New Forest. The grounds, of which there were about an acre and a half, were tastefully laid out, the northern side being an orchard. Solent View, seen under almost any aspect, whether in the storms of winter or the golden light of summer, was a charming place, and it seemed difficult to associate it with anything but peace and contentment. But there was a dark page in its history, and for long the simple country people in the neighbourhood passed it with bated breath, and spoke of it with a shudder. At the time the incidents occurred that I shall now relate, the house belonged to, and was in the occupation of, Mr. Oriel Farnell and his family. This gentleman, who was a widower, had spent 30 years of his life in India as an indigo planter, and, having made a fortune, he had returned to his native country to end his days in peace, as he hoped. His family consisted of 2 grown-up sons and a daughter, Lydia, who was about 21 years of age. Lydia, who had been born in India, was a most charming and amiable girl, and greatly beloved by her father. With the taste of an old Sybarite, Mr. Farnell had created a luxurious home and surrounded himself with every comfort. His household consisted of his own manservant, an Irishman named Michael Carron, who had been in India with him, having formerly been a soldier. Mr. Farnell was very fond of this man, and the man was said to be much attached to his master. In addition, there were a cook, 4 other female servants, a butler, a coachman and groom, and 2 gardeners. Mr. Farnell kept a good deal of company, for he was fond of society, and it was very seldom his house was altogether free from visitors. I have already spoken of Lydia Farnell as being a charming girl. She was charming in its widest sense, for in addition to a most amiable and loving disposition, she was exceedingly good-looking, a capital horsewoman, an artist of no mean talent, and highly accomplished. There was no wonder, therefore, that she had many admirers in the neighbourhood. The young men round about vied with each other in paying her attention, but she showed not the slightest disposition to favour any one of them. Being his only daughter, Mr. Farnell was by no means anxious that she should marry, for he could not bear the idea of losing her. In fact, the thought that some day she might leave his home was the one thing that seemed to cause him any anxiety, and if ever he ventured to hint at this, she would put her arms round his neck and say, "You know, papa dear, I am never going to leave you. I intend to be an old maid." Then would he answer, "No, darling, I don't want you to be an old maid. For one endowed as you are, that seems unnatural, but I am selfish enough to want you to stay with me for a long time yet." It seemed as if his wishes in this respect were to be realized, for out of their many male acquaintances there was not one that she displayed the slightest partiality for. It frequently happens that when a young lady is situated like this, she meets the man she can love under the most unexpected circumstances, and this was to prove the case in the present instance. Lydia's brothers were exceedingly fond of yachting, and they kept a 7-tonner moored in a little creek not far from the house, and were in the habit of going out in her in almost all weathers. They were expert sailors, but in addition to themselves they always had an old man-of-war's man with them, a naval pensioner who had been about 40 years at sea. And it was said in the neighbourhood that the Farnells' Water Witch, that was the name of their yacht, could go anywhere and do anything. One autumn morning they went out for a sail in company with their sister. It was in the beginning of October, and though there was a rawness in the air, and when they started a white mist on the water, with scarcely any wind, the mist gradually cleared away, the sun came out bright and warm, and a good south-east breeze sprang up, which was fair for either running down or coming up the Solent. Tempted by the fineness of the day, it was decided to run as far as the Needles. The wind presently freshened considerably, but as it still blew from the same quarter, they bowled along merrily. By the time they were off Alum Bay, the wind had increased to half a gale, but the Water Witch was exceptionally well found in every respect and well handled. At some distance ahead of them was another yacht, which they had been watching intently, owing to her eccentric movements, which arose from bad management. Suddenly the man-of-war's man, who was at the helm of the Water Witch, exclaimed, "Blowed if she won't turn the turtle directly, if they don't mind what they're a-doing of." He alluded, of course, to the strange yacht, and his remark was called forth by the lubberly manner in which the stranger had been allowed to fly round to the wind and heel over to a dangerous angle, so that her sheathing right down to the keel on the weather side flashed in the sunlight. "I think, Master George, we'll bear down on her, and see what they are about," said the helmsman to one of the brothers who was standing by him. "All right, Harry," was the answer. So the Water Witch was put almost before the wind, the other yacht being to leeward of them. In the course of a few minutes they had come near enough to make out that painted on her stern was the name Rover. 5 minutes later a passing squall caught both yachts, when, to the horror of all on board the Water Witch, the Rover was seen to capsize, and men were observed struggling in the water. The Farnells at once cut away their life buoys, got ropes ready, and swung their dinghy over. And when they were near enough the life buoys were thrown overboard, and 2 of the men who were struggling in the water clutched them. The other men had disappeared, and it was, alas, only too certain that they had disappeared forever. The Water Witch was brought up into the wind until all her sails were shaking. Then the dinghy was lowered, and the 2 brothers gallantly jumped in and went to the rescue of the drowning men. One was a young man about 25, the other a youth of 14 or 15. Only after great difficulty and a considerable personal risk did the Farnells succeed in rescuing them. They were then in such an extremely exhausted condition that they could not speak, and consequently could give no particulars of the disaster. No trace of any of the others who had been in the water was observed, so the brothers pulled to the yacht and put the rescued men on board. Fortunately there was plenty of bedding on board the Water Witch, together with brandy, and, as Lydia had been busy cooking some luncheon, there was hot water too, for attached to the little cooking stove in the galley was a boiler holding between 3 and 4 gallons. A hurried consultation was held as to what was best to be done, and the first idea was to run into Alum Bay. But doubtful of what accommodation they might get there, Lydia said, "Let us get home as speedily as possible." The Water Witch therefore was headed for home, and with tender solicitude the 2 brothers stripped off the wet clothes from the half-drowned men, swathed them in blankets, gave them hot brandy, and did other things necessary under the circumstances. For some time it seemed doubtful whether the youth would recover, and even the young man remained in an exceedingly exhausted condition, so that when the yacht reached her destination they had to be carried ashore and up to the house. Mr. Farnell, who was an exceedingly hospitable man, was much shocked when he heard of the disaster. He at once had the strangers put to bed, then dispatched a messenger on horseback to Lymington for the family doctor, who lost no time in attending. He gave the young Farnells great credit for what they had done, expressing a belief that had they not applied the remedies they did, both the man and the boy would have died. He said it would not be safe for the boy to be removed for 2 or 3 days, but the young man would probably be well enough to go away the next day. This, however, proved not to be the case, for a recollection of the disaster so overwhelmed him that he became delirious. From papers and letters found in his pocket, the Farnells learned that his name was Halesworth, and that he was connected with the London firm of Halesworth and Company in Leadenhall Street, and a telegraphic message was at once dispatched to the firm, with the result that as soon after as possible an elderly gentleman arrived. This was Mr. Stephen Halesworth, the young man's father, and by one of those strange coincidences that are constantly happening in real life, he proved to be an East India merchant, and knew Mr. Farnell very well by name. The young man who had come so near a watery grave was his only son, and the youth was his nephew. Mr. Halesworth, it need scarcely be said, was full of gratitude for what had been done, and stated that his son and nephew had been staying at Ventnor with 2 young friends, and it turned out that they had hired a yacht and had started off for the Needles, the yacht being in charge of an old fisherman and his son, both of whom, it appeared, were under the influence of liquor, and to this fact was due the capsizing of the yacht. Both the boatmen were drowned, as well as the other 2 young men. It is not necessary to dwell further upon the details of this sad disaster. Very frequently in accidents of this kind, when they are looked at from a philosophical point of view, there seems to be an ordered destiny in them. In the present case it certainly seemed so, for young Harry Halesworth, who owed his life to the Farnells, was fated to become the lover of Lydia. This did not come about at once, but the accident having brought the 2 families together, an intimacy sprang up, as it could hardly fail to do. Harry Halesworth had sisters, and they invited Lydia to London, and in return they were invited to Solent View. Harry, if not handsome, had a good deal to recommend him to a woman's notice. At any rate, where Lydia had been indifferent to the sighs and pleading looks of many other young men, she fell under the sway of Harry Halesworth. But it was not until the summer following the accident that anything definite occurred. Harry was a guest at Solent View, and one day while rambling in the New Forest with Lydia he declared his love for her, and drew from her a confession that she loved him. That evening young Halesworth spoke to Mr. Farnell, who received the communication somewhat coldly, and the next day Mr. Farnell had a conversation with his daughter, and he clearly showed that he had some prejudice against young Halesworth. He could give no reason for this beyond saying that he did not think Harry would make her happy. Perhaps, had he analysed his feelings, the true reason would have been found to be his dislike to losing the society and companionship of his daughter. A little later, when he saw that his daughter's happiness was involved in this matter, he said he would see Mr. Halesworth, Sr., and talk to him, and for that purpose he went up to London. Mr. Halesworth, who bore a high reputation for probity and honour, was candid enough to say that his son had been a little wild, and had been sent to a mercantile house in Spain in the hope that he would settle down. But he had got into trouble there with a lady, and was obliged to come home, though since then he had improved, and gave promise of turning out a good business man, and his father promised to set him up in business should he marry. This information did not tend to remove the prejudice Mr. Farnell had taken against young Halesworth, and on his way home again he resolved to put a stop at once to the courting. But when he saw how greatly attached Lydia was to her lover, he could not make up his mind to do this, and so he allowed the love-making to go on uninterruptedly for the next few days, and then, much to his relief, Halesworth took his departure, having to return to London. For some time previous to this, Mr. Farnell had been annoyed about another matter, quite apart from his daughter's love-making. The cause of this annoyance he kept to himself, but it was evident that letters he was receiving were troubling him. Whom the letters were from, or what they were about, his family did not know then, and though they asked, he declined to tell them. A fortnight later, he suddenly announced his intention one morning of going to London on some business, as he termed it, though he would not state what the business was, which was very unusual with him. His conduct was so out of the ordinary, and his withholding his affairs from his children so remarkable, that they were much concerned. Lydia wished to go to London with him, but he would not hear of it. In fact, for the first time within her recollection, when she said she would go, he displayed anger toward her. He had changed considerably lately, and from a jovial, genial man he seemed to have become moody and despondent, and his children could not help a feeling of anxiety after he had started on his journey. 2 days later, Harry Halesworth came down to Solent View quite unexpectedly. He told Lydia that an irresistible desire to see her had come over him, and he was determined to see her at all hazards. Now his coming during Mr. Farnell's absence was a mere accident, for he did not know that Mr. Farnell was away, and conscious that it might lead to unpleasantness, he wished to cross that evening to the Isle of Wight. The young Farnells, however, would not hear of it, saying that they would put him up, and promising him some shooting the next day in the forest. He appealed to Lydia to know what he was to do, and she said stay, and so he stopped. That evening, as these young people sat in the drawing-room engaged in playing whist, they were suddenly startled by boom, 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 3 distinct, sonorous booms of the iron bell up in the tower. The booms did not follow in quick succession, but there was an interval of several seconds between each. It was, in fact, like the tolling of a passing bell. The brothers and sister looked at each other in amazement, perhaps even with some alarm, but Halesworth took little or no notice. To him it had no meaning. It is possible he did not even know there was a bell in the tower. Without speaking, George, the eldest son, rose and rang the drawing-room bell, and when the maid appeared he asked, "Who is that ringing the tower bell? Do you know, Jane?" The girl looked a little scared as she answered, "No, sir, I don't know." George left the room in company with his brother, and they went down to the servants' hall, where they made inquiries, but everyone vowed that he or she had not rung the bell in the tower. Who had then? That was the question. Consternation was visible on the faces of all the servants who had heard the superstition about the bell tolling before the death of a member of the family. No one could ring the bell from below, and no one could ring it at all without passing through the house. While the younger Farnell went out in the grounds, George told the butler to follow him, and taking a light he went upstairs, then along a passage, at the end of which was a wooden door that gave entrance to the upper part of the tower. There was no communication between the upper and lower part, the lower part being used as a storehouse. The key of this door was kept hanging on a nail in the wall, and it was hanging there now. George took it down, opened the door, and went up the flight of winding stairs that led to the top of the tower. The butler followed in some trepidation. He was evidently afraid. There was no one in the bell loft, and no sign of anyone having been there. The young man went down again, feeling considerably mystified. During the absence of the brothers, Halesworth naturally asked some questions about the bell, and his sweetheart told him the legend. When the brothers returned to the room, the younger one had been round to the grounds with the gardener and coachman. They deemed it better not to say anything to their sister, and the game of whist was resumed. The next morning the two brothers and Halesworth started off for a day's shooting, and that afternoon, before they were back, Mr. Farnell came home. He seemed to be much cast down, and his face had a haggard, troubled look. His daughter entreated him to tell her what was the matter, but for the second time in her life he answered her roughly and told her to ask no questions. She was highly alarmed at his changed appearance and unusual manner, and, though she dreaded telling him now about Harry Halesworth being down, she felt that it was her duty to do so. When he heard of it he flew into a passion, and said it must have been a planned thing. Later on, when the shooting party came back, Mr. Farnell addressed Halesworth in passionate language. He accused him of deceit and something worse. He told him to leave the house and never come back any more, and he vowed that he would never sanction Lydia's marriage with him. Halesworth was dumbfounded at this extraordinary reception, and George and his brothers seriously thought that their father was suffering from sudden aberration of intellect. As for poor Lydia, she was broken-hearted. Stung by the unjust treatment and the harsh words that had been used to him, Halesworth so far lost command of himself as to speak sharply in return. He resented the accusation of deceit. This seemed to arouse Mr. Farnell still more, and he applied a strong epithet to the young man, and accused him again of having taken advantage of his absence to come there. The young Farnells and their sister were indignant that their visitors should be treated in such a way. But what could they do? They remonstrated with their father to no purpose, and then they apologized to Halesworth, who, of course, had no alternative but to go, and go at once. His parting from Lydia was a painful one, because they did not know when they might meet again. "You must think nothing of this, dear," she said, as she clung to him with her arms round his neck. "There is something the matter with Papa. I have never seen him like this before, and I quite think his head has gone wrong." "Perhaps it is so, darling," he answered. "But unless he requests me to come, you see how impossible it will be for me to visit you again." "Oh, Harry," she cried in alarm, "you are surely not going to give me up? You have taught me to love you, and I cannot part from you now." "No," he answered. "If you don't want to give me up, nothing shall part us." "Harry," she said tearfully, "you know that I do not want to give you up. I will be true to you for all time. You must not take what my father has said seriously. I really do not think he is responsible for what he said tonight. Something has gone wrong with him, and it must be something very dreadful to produce such a sudden and wonderful change. I am sure all will come right in the end." "Yes, but when?" asked Harry, with a lover's impatience. "I hope before very long," she answered. "Anyway, darling," he said, "you will write to me, will you not?" "Yes." "And if I come down clandestinely, you will meet me somewhere?" She hesitated. The question troubled her. She had never in her life deceived her father, and so she had to choose between love and duty now, and the struggle was a severe one. "I think, dearest," she replied tenderly, "that you must for a while be satisfied with my letters. I am quite hopeful I shall soon bring Papa to my way of thinking." This answer did not satisfy Halesworth. It was not calculated to satisfy any ardent young lover who was smarting from a sense of a wrong done him, and who firmly believed he had been badly treated. "Oh, well, if you don't choose to see me," he exclaimed a little sharply, though of course he did not mean it, "I think the best thing we can do is to part forever." She was wounded by this reply, and she answered, though equally, of course, she did not mean it, "Very well, dear, if that is your wish, let it be so." He had spoken with warmth and anger. She spoke sorrowfully and lovingly. The conversation had passed in the hall, and they were now interrupted by the sudden appearance of Mr. Farnell, who sternly ordered his daughter to bed, and said to Halesworth, "You are a scoundrel to be making love to my child after you have been ordered to leave the house. Go at once, or I will have you turned out." "Yes, sir, I will go," answered Halesworth hotly, "but you shall not insult me with impunity, and depend upon it, you will regret this night's work." Lydia, who was on the stairs, heard this, and she went to her room almost in hysterics. The butler and a chambermaid also heard it, for they were passing at the time. Halesworth waited for no further reply. He had said his say and left the house. He walked to Lymington, where he engaged a bed at the hotel. But he could well have done without a bed, for he did not sleep during the whole night. He paced restlessly up and down. He was in a state of excitement. Sorrow at parting from Lydia and indignation at the way he had been treated mingled, and he was at a loss how to act. But as the morning dawned, and when he remembered how sharply he had spoken to Lydia, and that he had been forced to leave her before he could ask her forgiveness, he felt disposed not to go from the neighbourhood until he had seen her again. Nearly the whole of the next day he lay in bed, and in the evening, when darkness fell, he went out. He returned to the hotel at 11 o'clock. The landlady happened to meet him in the passage, and she was struck by his white face and his agitated manner. He was not only deadly pale, but was evidently suffering from strong excitement. "Whatever is the matter with you?" she asked. "Are you ill?" "Yes," he faltered, "but it's not serious. I will have a little hot brandy and water, and go to bed." Halesworth drank his brandy at one draught, and taking the candle the landlady offered him, he went up to his bedroom. And at the same time, and within about 200 yards of his house, Mr. Farnell was lying on his back on the road dead. He had been killed by a bullet in the brain. Mr. Farnell's body lay in the road for nearly 2 hours before it was discovered. It would not have been discovered then, but a gamekeeper passing along actually stumbled over it. The man was startled and struck a match to see who it was who was lying there, and then he recognized Mr. Farnell and rushed up to the house to spread the alarm. Mr. Farnell's absence had not up to this time caused any feeling of uneasiness, for he had gone to visit a neighbor about 1.5 miles away, and whenever he went there, which he did every Thursday night to have a rubber at whist, of which he was very fond, it was late before he came back. His sons and daughter had gone to bed, and so had most of the servants, but the butler was still up. He invariably sat up when his master was out. He went to the door when the bell was rung, and instead of seeing his master as he expected, he saw the gamekeeper, who was agitated and excited, and whose face was as white as a ghost's. "Hullo, what's the matter?" exclaimed the butler. "My God, something awful!" stammered the man huskily. "The master's lying dead there in the road." The butler turned as pale as the gamekeeper now, and reeled with the sudden shock the abrupt announcement caused him. "Dead!" he gasped. "Aye, he's been shot." "Are you sure?" "Sure? There's no mistake about it. I tumbled over his body." The butler seemed stunned, but when he went to Michael Carron's room and knocked at the door, Michael opened it instantly, and strangely enough he was dressed. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Come with me," gasped the butler. "The master's been shot." Michael made no reply, but followed the butler downstairs. Then they put on their hats, took stout oaken sticks from the stick rack, and went with the gamekeeper out into the darkness. It was an exceptionally dark night, and in their excitement they had forgotten a lantern, so Michael went back for one. Thus provided, they walked rapidly along the road. The night wind moaned weirdly among the trees, and the hoarse murmur of the sea could be heard. The men soon came to where the body was lying, and it needed no professional man to assure them that Mr. Farnell was stone dead. He was lying partly on his side, with one leg doubled up underneath him, one hand across his chest, and the other stretched at full length. The fingers of that hand were tightly clenched, and were full of dirt, indicating that after he had been shot he had struggled a little. The butler was greatly affected, for he had been many years in Mr. Farnell's service. Still, he had the presence of mind enough to notice the exact position of the body, with the details I have mentioned. That done, he sent the gamekeeper off to Lymington for the doctor. Not that a doctor could be of any service, but it seemed the proper thing to do. But before starting, the gamekeeper said, "I wonder who has done this?" "There's only one man I know of likely to do it," returned the butler, "and that man is Harry Halesworth, who has been courting Miss Lydia." "Good heavens! You don't say so!" cried the gamekeeper. "Yes, I do. He quarrelled with the master last night, and I heard him threaten him, and it's him that's done it, sure as we're here." "Then I'd best tell the police," the gamekeeper replied. "Yes, certainly." The gamekeeper went off on his mission, and then Michael and the butler carried the body to the house, not without some difficulty. That done, the butler went upstairs and aroused the sons. They were terribly shocked, as may be imagined, when they heard the news. Between 5 and 6 the doctor and the inspector of police arrived. The former proceeded at once to an examination of the body, the latter to making such inquiries as were necessary in a case of this kind. The doctor reported that death had resulted from a gunshot wound in the head, and that death had ensued within half an hour of the wound being made. He succeeded in extracting the bullet. It was a round bullet, and had been fired from a smooth-bore gun. The inquiries of the inspector of police led him irresistibly to the conclusion that suspicion pointed very strongly indeed to Harry Halesworth as the culprit, and he hurried off to ascertain the whereabouts of that young man. It was not until nearly 9 o'clock in the morning that Lydia was informed by her younger brother of the father's death. She became almost frantic when she heard the news. Then she reminded her brother about the mysterious ringing of the bell in the tower the night before the murder. There was mystery there which neither he nor she attempted to explain. The news of the murder soon spread and caused immense excitement in the district, for Mr. Farnell was widely known and universally respected. Before the afternoon had come, the arrest of Harry Hailsworth had been effected. He was arrested at the hotel in Lymington, and was in bed when the police went to the house. For the greater part of the night he had lain awake, and had only fallen asleep about 8 o'clock. To those behind the scenes it seemed as if there never had been a clearer case of circumstantial evidence. The prisoner had been ordered from the house by Mr. Farnell, and had been heard by the butler and a chambermaid to utter what was construed into a threat. The exact words, as repeated by the butler, on whom they seemed to have made a deep impression, were, "You shall not insult me with impunity, and, depend upon it, you will rue this night's work." Then the landlady of the hotel where he stayed said that he was very excited when he first went there. He lay in bed nearly the whole of the next day, and went out as darkness fell. It was between 11 and 12 when he returned to the hotel. His landlady was struck then by his white face and agitation, and she asked him if he was ill. He answered that he was, but not seriously, and then he drank some brandy and water at a draught and went upstairs. These details, as told by the landlady, left little doubt in the minds of those who heard them that the prisoner had murdered Mr. Farnell, and the energies of the police were directed to discovering the gun from which the fatal bullet had been fired. The news of her lover's arrest fell heavily indeed upon Lydia. It was a double blow beneath which she almost sank. And as she remembered his rough words to her at their last parting, and his apparent menace to her father, she could not help thinking that he was guilty, and yet it broke her heart to think so. The death of her father, and the arrest of her lover on a charge of being the murderer, so overwhelmed Lydia that she became utterly prostrated, and in a few hours it was painfully evident she had lost her reason. It was therefore deemed advisable by her friends to remove her and place her under the care of some relatives in Southampton. All the circumstances of the case were so remarkable, and in some respects romantic, that it aroused unusual interest. Of course, the mysterious tolling of the bell the night before the crime soon became known, for servants will gossip, and this served to add a new element of mystery to what was already mysterious enough, for to most people it really seemed as if that affair was utterly incapable of explanation. The superstition about the ringing of the bell just before the death of a member of the family was a faith with the simple country folk in the neighbourhood, and though they had had no evidence before that tended to confirm the belief, here at last was testimony that no one in his senses could deny. The body of Mr. Farnell was duly committed to the grave, and on that once happy home fell the heavy shadows of a never-ending sorrow. Not for a long time had a crime excited such universal interest throughout the country as this had done. The position of the parties, the fact that the suspected person had been the lover of the daughter of the deceased man, and that she herself had become demented, as well as that mystery about the bell, invested the crime with a glamour of weirdness and romance that rendered it peculiarly conspicuous. The papers made capital out of it, and people journeyed from long distances simply to satisfy their morbid curiosity by gazing on the house and staring up at the tower where hung the bell that was supposed to have been rung by ghostly hands. After the funeral, George and his brother felt that the place had become hateful to them, and they went to London as soon as they could get away, leaving the house in charge of the servants and the police. The preliminary inquiries before the magistrates elicited little or nothing that was new against the accused. His friends were distracted, and employed one of the most eminent barristers in London to defend him. At first, Hailsworth seemed so dazed by the charge brought against him as to be unable to comprehend what was passing. But he quickly recovered, and then protested his innocence. All the evidence the police were able to get together formed what would have been a chain strong enough to hang any man, had it not been that one and an important link was missing. That missing link was the gun. Could they have traced possession of the gun to the prisoner, the evidence would have been overwhelming, but they could not do so. It was proved that on the day of the murder the prisoner and the two young Farnells had been out shooting. Each carried a gun, but it was of a totally different caliber to that from which the bullet found in the dead man's brain had been fired. Then George Farnell swore that when they returned from the shooting expedition he took the guns himself and placed them in the gun room, a small room where they kept their guns, fishing tackle, sails, and other things of a like kind. This room was invariably kept locked, and only he and his brother had keys. Besides, there was not a gun in the house that would fit the bullet. Then again, no gun was missing, so that, assuming the possibility that the accused had used one of the guns belonging to the Farnells, he must have taken it back again, and that certainly seemed too ridiculous to be entertained by sensible men. He could not have bought a gun in Lymington without it being known. Where, then, did it come from? Mr. Farnell had certainly been shot. The bullet that killed him had certainly been fired from a gun, for experts swore that the pistol was not in existence that would take it was so large. It had, in fact, been fired from a very old-fashioned smooth-bore gun of a caliber which was no longer made. This imparted a new element of mystery to the case, and people asked, "Where is the gun?" The woods, lanes, and ditches were searched for miles around, but without result, and the Solent was even dragged, but the gun was not forthcoming, and the police were baffled. But notwithstanding this missing link, the magistrates who held the inquiry returned a verdict of wilful murder against Harry Halesworth, and he was duly committed for trial, which would take place at Southampton during the assizes. During all this dreadful time Lydia was in a condition of mind which prevented her knowing anything of what was happening. As is frequently, if not always the case, where dementia results from a sudden shock, her memory was an entire blank as to the past, and her friends said, sorrowfully, that under the circumstances it was a blessing that she had been so afflicted. The accused, who knew nothing of Lydia's condition, was in a state of prostration himself, but to every one with whom he came in contact he vowed solemnly that he was innocent, while his poor father and mother and sisters declared that he was incapable of such a dastardly deed. Of course this proved nothing. People charged with murder usually do declare themselves innocent, and their near relations will never bring themselves to believe in their guilt until confession places it beyond doubt. But in the present instance the unfortunate Halesworths found numerous sympathizers, and many people believed as they did. It was such a terrible blow for a family situated as they were. Their high respectability, their social position, naturally made them objects of unusual interest, as well as of commiseration, in the awful misfortune that had overtaken them. After the magisterial inquiry had closed, Mr. Halesworth, who had been present, went to Solent View by request of the sons. They were all cast down, as may be imagined, but Mr. Halesworth was almost distracted, and in a burst of grief he exclaimed, my God, this dreadful affair will kill me! But willingly would I die now if I could be assured of my poor boy's innocence." Then to George Farnell he said appealingly, "George, what is your opinion? Do you believe my unhappy son is guilty of your father's death?" George hesitated for some time. Then he made answer thus: "I confess that I am puzzled. Sometimes I think he is, and at others I cannot bring myself to think so. Many circumstances point to him as my father's murderer, but there are others again that do not seem reconcilable with that conclusion." "Then, George," said Halesworth solemnly and hoarsely, as if his emotion was choking him, "if you have the shadow of a shade of doubt of Harry's guilt, it is your duty in the sight of God and man to leave no stone unturned, either to prove him innocent or leave his guilt no longer a matter of doubt at any rate in your own mind." "But how am I to do that?" asked the young man in great distress. "How? Need you ask me? You must know more of your father's affairs than anyone else. You are in a position to form an opinion of his habits, and whether he was likely to have made an enemy or enemies who would resort to the dreadful expedient of slaying him, either from motives of revenge or something else we cannot determine. So much lies in your power, and if you neglect aught, if you fail in the least degree to do what you are bound to do, a curse will rest upon you and yours for all time." Mr. Halesworth spoke in an impassioned way, and as a man might speak who was stricken with a sorrow that was almost beyond human endurance. His words, argument, and manner made a deep and abiding impression on George, and, pondering that night deeply on what had passed, he remembered how for some little time before his death his father had behaved strangely. He had received letters that had annoyed him, and it was so obvious to his children that he was grievously troubled that they pressed him for some statement, but he had told them nothing. Then his strange journey to London and his changed manner, his anxious and haggard face, all pointed to a trouble of some kind that he was anxious to conceal. Here, then, thought the young man, was a mystery that it was his bounden duty to try and solve. After all, it perhaps had no bearing on the murder, but on the other hand it might have. And those 2 words "might have" were a mandate to George Farnell that he dare not ignore, lest that curse of which Mr. Halesworth spoke should come upon him and his. That night, in the solemn hours, as he lay there pondering, his resolution was taken. Up to this point the late Mr. Farnell's papers had remained untouched, for the dreadful business had so overwhelmed everybody, especially the sons, that they could do nothing. By the will in the hands of the family lawyer, he, the lawyer, and the 2 sons were appointed executors. The day following his resolution, therefore, George dispatched an urgent message to the lawyer, a venerable and highly respected gentleman, who valued honour before self-interest, and when he arrived he and the young man proceeded to go through Mr. Farnell's papers. To men who are not altogether without sentiment, there is no more melancholy duty than that of going through the papers of a deceased friend or relative. They are the written records of schemes, hopes, joys, sorrows, of all the alternating experiences of life. But he who called them forth lies cold in the grave. The busy brain will think no more. The eyes that read are blind for ever. The hand that wrote is in the dust. But then there is something even deeper still. A dead man's papers are a dead man's secrets, for there are things that a man keeps even from his nearest and dearest friend, but about which he may have some written record. And so when he is dead, and those who come after him have to rummage among his dusty documents, his folded letters, many of them, it may be, yellow and time-stained, they cannot help feeling that they are opening the dead man's heart, as it were, and reading the secrets written there, and which only death could bring to light. Through the whole of that day George and the lawyer kept at their task, and when the night was falling they came across 4 or 5 letters tied together with a morsel of twine, and carefully stowed away in a secret drawer in a large old-fashioned escritoire, that is, secret so long as the owner was living, but was secret no longer now that he had gone down into the dust. And those letters were read with astonishment, and with a sense that a fearful revelation was being made. These letters seemed then, in that first reading, destined to clear up the mystery which surrounded the crime. Long and earnestly did the 2 men discuss what they had brought to light, and then they decided on a plan, which led the lawyer to start off by the first train the following morning for London. Then, guided by what the letters revealed, he drove to a house in the quiet and genteel neighbourhood of Balham, and inquired for Mrs. Ella Raintree. An old woman, who seemed to be the housekeeper and general servant, informed the lawyer that Mrs. Ella Raintree was seriously ill in bed and could not be seen. But he would take no denial. He insisted on seeing her, and after some difficulty succeeded in being admitted into the lady's chamber, the pressing nature of the business upon which he had come rendering it impossible that he could observe the formalities and ceremonies of ordinary occasions. Mrs. Ella Raintree was in bed. That she was desperately ill was obvious to the most unpractised eye. In age she was perhaps a little more than 30, and at one time must have been remarkably good-looking. But now she was emaciated, blasée, young though she was, with unmistakable evidence in her face of dissipation. The lawyer introduced himself, and when he did that Mrs. Ella Raintree seemed to be seized with some great fear. For 2 long hours he sat with her, and when he left he felt that he had cut a Gordian knot, or at any rate unravelled a very tangled skein. He got back late that night to Solent View, and late as it was, he remained closeted with George Farnell for 2 hours before they retired. The following morning he was up early and rode into Lymington, and soon after he arrived there 3 constables in plain clothes set off for Solent View, and this indicated that some fresh development of the strange drama was about to take place. When they reached their destination they found all in the place in a state of excitement, for another tragedy had taken place. In a loft over the stable Michael Carron was lying dead. He had died by his own hand. He had placed the muzzle of a loaded pistol in his mouth, and pulling the trigger had shattered his head. Was this another mystery? Well, it might have been, but was not. Carron, in giving up his life, doing an act of justice. He put into writing a confession that it was his hand that slew Mr. Farnell, and he did more than this. He gave a detailed statement as to why he had done so dreadful a deed. And he said that the old gun with which he had shot his master he had kept by him for years, for that very purpose, if ever he got confirmation of suspicions he had long entertained. After the murder he carried the gun some 5 miles or so, and hid it in a hollow oak tree, and he clearly indicated the spot. He also stated that it was he who had tolled the bell which had announced Mr. Farnell's doom, but it also announced his own doom. The evil that men do lives after them, and the reason for Karen's crime may be briefly told. This reason was disclosed in those letters which the lawyer and George discovered in the secret drawer of the escritoire. Then it was confirmed and amplified by the lawyer's interview with Mrs. Ella Raintree, who told him all that he wished to know, and it was doubly confirmed by the desperate suicide of Karen, who, suspecting correctly, that the lawyer had solved the mystery and was going to London to see the woman, took his punishment in his own hand, preferring a suicide's end to that at the hands of the executioner. But he stated in his letter of confession that he had resolved to confess before Harry Halesworth was brought up for trial. The story, as told by Karen and confirmed by the lawyer, was sad and terrible, and sullied the honour of Mr. Farnell. 12 years before this a young woman had come to Solent View as lady's maid to Mrs. Farnell, who was then living. She bore the unromantic name of Fanny Smith. She was a conspicuously pretty girl, and Michael Karen, in the process of time, fell desperately in love with her, and she apparently returned his love, and it was agreed that they should be married later on. Then Mrs. Farnell died, and pretty Fanny Smith's services were retained for Lydia, who was a young girl. Soon after this, Karen began to feel jealous of his master, though he could never get any reliable evidence to justify that jealousy. The year following Mrs. Farnell's death, Fanny suddenly disappeared. Karen believed that her disappearance was due to his master, who had robbed him of his intended bride, but he could get no proof, though he swore an oath on the Bible that if ever he did get proof, no matter how long after it might be, he would shoot his master. Act the second of this little domestic drama reveals Fanny installed in London, where she was occasionally, and with great caution, repeatedly visited by Mr. Farnell. She became a mother, but when her child was 2 years old it died. Then Fanny's nature seemed to change. She slid down the hill rapidly, and for many years Mr. Farnell lost sight of her. What her life was during those years need not be told here. Suddenly she came to the surface again and wrote to Farnell demanding all sorts of things. She wrote several letters, and at last he went to see her, when she demanded an extravagantly large sum of money and threatened to expose him if he did not give it. He refused, and in a moment of pique, and knowing nothing of Karen's oath, she wrote to him, telling him all. Then the fulfilment of the oath followed, and when Fanny, then under the assumed name of Mrs. Ella Raintree, heard of Mr. Farnell's death, and knowing that she had brought it about, she became prostrated with illness from which she was destined never to recover, for her constitution was shattered. When these facts all came out at the trial of young Halesworth, he was of course acquitted, but the terrible ordeal through which he had passed had so told upon him that his own friends scarcely knew him. Crushed in spirit, and broken-hearted about Lydia, he went to Australia. 6 years later Lydia Farnell recovered her reason as suddenly as she had lost it. The fact was announced to Halesworth by George Farnell himself, for they had kept up a constant correspondence, and Halesworth, who had been true to his love, returned, and shortly after he and Lydia were wedded. As gold must be tried in the fire, so the heart must be tried by pain. Their hearts had surely been tried by pain, but the reward had come at last. Soon after the winding up of Mr. Farnell's affairs, Solent View, to which George succeeded, was put into the market, but the evil reputation it had acquired so depreciated its value that the owner resolved to keep it until time had purged it. But some years later, owing to the carelessness of an old man and woman who lived in it as caretakers, it was reduced to ashes, and though it was fully insured, George Farnell refused to rebuild it and sold the land. End of Story 19. Recording by Colleen McMahon.